Hello, everybody. My name is Tab Combs. I am a research associate and a lecturer at the University of North Carolina in our Department of City and Regional Planning. And I'm here to talk a little bit today about the mobility adaptations that cities across the world implemented in response to changing mobility demands and changing demands on public space during the COVID-19 pandemic. For full disclosure, I am a planner, so most of what I'm saying is aimed specifically at the planning profession, but the information and the lessons that I hope we draw from it apply broadly to planning, policy, and engineering fields, as well as just to advocates and others who are interested in equitable, sustainable, and resilient mobility systems. So, during the COVID-19 pandemic, cities around the world took really creative steps, really bold steps, to change the way people use public space. Most notable of these changes were changes to the way road space was allocated. As schools and businesses shut down and workers who could work remotely stayed home, we saw a dramatic drop in motor vehicle traffic and a simultaneous spike in demand for safe places to walk, bike, and exercise outside, physically distanced from other humans. And thousands of cities around the world responded by taking road space away from cars and giving it over to other public uses. Today I'm going to share some of what I've found through documenting these responses around the world and talk about how these responses may help show us the way to better practices for urban mobility planning and policy. And my goal here is to convince you that it's not just what happened that matters, but how and why it happened as well. So the pandemic ushered in a dramatic shift in how cities think about and allocate space for people who walk, roll, and bike. Creating space for non-car modes normally takes years, if not even decades, and sometimes never actually happens. Yet, during the early months of the pandemic, cities seemed to be able to create these spaces practically overnight. So something big shifted in the way city leaders thought about and valued public roadway space. And a lot of people are asking, which of these changes to public space are going to outlast the pandemic? And when that happens, I usually respond with, how has the pandemic changed practices regarding the allocation of public space, and which of those practice changes will stick around after the pandemic? Hopefully, during the course of this talk, you'll see why I believe that's the question we need to be looking for answers to. The state of mobility practice, how we plan, design, install, and maintain our transportation infrastructure and systems, is in dire need of an overhaul. The environmental, economic, social costs and cost disparities of car dependence are all well documented, but changing the status quo has been really hard. Any gains we get in moving away from a car-based system are marginal and desperately hard won. But COVID was different somehow. The pandemic underscored long-standing inequities in mobility systems, highlighted the lack of resilience in these systems, and in some cases, and for some people, gave a glimpse of what could be, meaning that it revealed previously underestimated demand for non-driving uses of public space. And it did so in a way that previous crises seemingly failed to do. Think climate change, road safety, obesity crises. None of these have been able to move the needle like COVID has. But the pandemic also revealed problems with planning processes. Can we really only have good walking and biking facilities when we ran them through overnight as part of a crisis response? Did we not learn anything from the previous 70 years of top-down transportation planning that was kicked off by the Interstate Highways Act? Can we not take the time to engage the public in decisions about public space? Is a pandemic the best way to change transportation? As we're hopefully emerging from the pandemic, we need to learn both from how our mobility needs changed during the pandemic, but also from the processes behind our city's responses to these changes. And that's really the only way to move to a new set of planning practices that better equip us to build a more just and resilient transportation future. So there are a lot of theories of how practices change, how new best practices are identified, adopted, and spread across the field. What we saw during 2020 encapsulated many of these theories. So the pandemic, triggered the simultaneous global recognition of a problematic outcome of conventional practices. In this case, prioritization of cars as the main users of public space. Cities made rapid adjustments to those practices on the fly. Cities also looked to each other for novel ways to make those adjustments, which meant that these ideas and changes spread around the world almost as fast as the virus itself. Many cities also figured out how to evaluate the impacts of their changes, and in some cases, even reflected on the processes behind those changes and were able to adjust them in situ and on the fly. And all of this occurred simultaneously at global scale during the course of less than a year. And I mean, it was absolute chaos out there for anyone trying to document the changes. But in that chaos are some really powerful lessons, pivotal ways in which practices were altered, in which norms and goals about public road space shifted, and in which mobility outcomes changed. Some of the shifts in how cities treat public road space had some negative consequences, but many others seem to have arisen through positive processes that in turn may produce long-lasting positive outcomes that may be replicable even in non-pandemic times. My work, my goal is to sort through the chaos and identify the processes that cities used, link them to outcomes, both good and bad, so that we can start figuring out which new approaches, which new planning processes might become our new best practices in a post-pandemic, but not post-crisis world. So back in March of last year, of 2020, I saw a Google alert about the city of Philadelphia's decision to start their summer open streets program early in order to create COVID-safe recreational space. And I thought, hey, other cities might do this too. So I took to social media to find some examples. Fast forward 20 months or so to now, and we've got a data set to date of over 1,400 such actions in more than 500 locations around the world. Close to 900 of those actions involved explicit reallocations of public road space away from personal motor vehicles and towards walking, biking, and outdoor commerce. This database, it's called the Shifting Streets Global COVID Mobility Database, and it's available to download and use for free at headbikeinfo.org/shiftingstreets. We've organized the 1,400 some records by function. So street space for active mobility, street space for commerce, programs meant to improve access to bicycles and bike share, other active mobility supports, other commerce supports, and policy and finance actions to influence planning for active mobility. Here's a map, if you will, showing where the actions took place vis-a-vis street space. You're welcome to dig through this image some on your own if you like. You can download it from the open access paper through the link at the bottom of your screen. I'm showing it here in case it helps you grasp the enormity of how cities changed up their street space. And that's really the main takeaway from all this, that the pandemic prompted a wave of new approaches to accommodating walking and biking all around the world. And these approaches all had one thing in common, and that's that they happened fast. The traditional barriers to implementing walking and bicycling facilities, that there's not enough space, not enough money, not enough analysis, not enough support, they seemingly vanished overnight. And this vanishing act raises some really big questions. Why did these barriers disappear, and will they stay gone? I'm guessing this question's really on a lot of our minds. Will the changes that we saw happening to our streets during the pandemic stick around? Answering this question is a big part of developing new practices because, thankfully, hopefully, we're not always going to be living with the crisis conditions that triggered all of these changes. We can start answering these questions about what changes and what new practices might outlast the pandemic by examining the motivations behind cities' various responses. And we can start to get at that by looking at the evolution of responses over time. So early on, back in March of 2020, cities were focused mostly on minimizing virus transmission. And they did this by creating takeout zones for restaurants and automating walk signals. Then in April, we start to see a big interest in creating street space for walking and biking. That's the solid blue line there. In the beginning, this came almost entirely in the form of full street closures in cities that already had a history of these kinds of events. As, as that line gets steeper, that's when we start seeing a lot of curb space reallocations. Cities look to create mobility corridors to make up for drastic drops in transit ridership. We also start to see a lot of soft closures of neighborhood streets, partly to help connect those mobility corridors, but also in response to recognition that kids are going to be out of school for a very long time and they need safe places to play. Once summer rolls around, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we see a growing interest in carving out street space for commerce. That's the solid purple line. As cities responded to calls from restaurants and stores desperate for safe ways to stay open during the pandemic. So what we're seeing here, it's an evolution, from public health responses early on to reduce the risk of disease transmission, to reacting to changing mobility demands, and then to keeping businesses afloat. To me, this is signaling a gradual recognition on the part of cities that public space isn't best used for driving cars. Another key is to look at when individual cities began their responses. Here, we're seeing the start dates for U.S. cities changes, specifically the allocation of street space for walking, biking, and outdoor commerce. As you can see, some cities were able to move quickly and comprehensively, while others had substantially slower and more limited responses. Part of understanding what happens next depends on understanding these differences in response speed and scale. Was it differences in active mobility cultures, differences in state-level policies, in resources or institutional frameworks, or was it something else? I don't have the answers to these questions yet, but hopefully as we keep collecting more detailed data, some answers are going to start to emerge. But it's more than just deciding that people need space to go out to eat outdoors. The idea of exactly what to do, where to do it, how to do it, those are real questions city leaders had to grapple with. And once the catalyst of the pandemic is gone, hopefully, these are the questions we need to be asking if we hope to see cities continuing to create spaces for walking and biking and just existing outdoors in the public realm. And we could actually spend a few weeks just talking about how cities decided to act. But right now I want to talk about where and specifically from whom the ideas about how to act came from. Who got to be involved in cities' decision-making processes? And that's a huge question because at the same time, many people were rejoicing that cities were finally willing to make dramatic changes to how people get around in cities. Others were pointing out that this process, the dramatic overnight changes to street space, many of which required police involvement to implement and maintain, was just another manifestation of entrenched systemic racism that's kind of been plaguing the transportation planning profession since its inception. And the data bear this out. The vast majority of the actions we saw popping up were unlinked from public input processes. Up to 92% of them were entirely new, explicitly in response to COVID. They weren't part of pre-existing plans, and in most cases weren't even linked to ongoing planning processes or community discussions about mobility. And yeah, there are exceptions for sure, but wow, that's a lot of top-down planning that affects huge amounts of public space. And that's problematic, especially with respect to conversations about making these specific actions permanent. So I want to talk a little bit now about my specific takeaways from this research, from my time collecting and evaluating information about these street changes. For starters, here's what we know. Cities did a lot of creative things, which means that cities learned they can do a lot of things. The rapid and wide-ranging responses that we saw suggest cities have the ability to be creative. Barriers that previously blocked or slowed new ped-bike and road safety infrastructure projects were overcome. Cities became more tolerant of experimentation of their transportation systems, and new innovative public engagement strategies started to emerge. And here's what we think we know. Cities' responses seem to track somewhat with the pandemic, which suggests that these were crisis responses rather than strategic or plan-based responses. The data from the timeline of intervention rollouts and the stated drivers, both of which are in the database, support this idea. We also believe the vast majority of the responses aren't linked to previous or ongoing planning processes or efforts in most cases, and public engagement wasn't often a priority. Now, there are some bright spots that are exceptions to this, including places like Oakland, California, who pushed their slow streets interventions out really quickly, got in hot water with the public, and then started over, letting community members set the agenda. And there are probably a lot of other examples out there of cities that, even if they started with a top-down approach, quickly figured out how to do it from the bottom up. And the more we can learn about those examples, and the processes behind their decisions on whether and how to act, the better equipped we are to develop new best practices. And finally, what we need to learn a whole lot more about. First, with respect to processes. Where were these bright spots and what made them work? What new ways of interacting with the public worked, and which of them might prove useful, relevant, and actionable after the pandemic? Does having a mobility plan matter? Recall that most of the responses we recorded weren't connected to existing plans. Why not? And how can we change that for future disruptive events? For cities that do have mobility plans in place, what can we do to ensure the information in those plans is available to guide how we react during times of crisis? And what other policies or programs might be put in place now to allow for more flexible and equitable responses to future disruptions? One example is from Washington State, where the state DOT published guidelines early in the pandemic on how municipalities can go about reallocating space on state-owned highways. I'd love to know whether this is a harbinger of a movement to, say, incorporate mobility in state-level emergency management plans. We also have a lot to learn about the long-term impacts of these interventions. We have a little bit of data already. Some places are doing a bang-up job recording travel changes, but we need to go beyond the immediate impacts on travel behavior and look at longer-term impacts across a wide range of metrics. Because the feedback on these various responses is not unequivocally positive, some interventions in some cities work better for some people than others, and there were vast systemic disparities in the distribution of costs and benefits of these interventions, something that's readily evident in public feedback and media stories. As a field, we really need to get a handle on these impacts, because despite the tragedy of the pandemic and the arguable missteps in our responses to it, there have been some tangible benefits that have emerged from this COVID streets phenomenon. The biggest upshot, in my opinion, is how cities have managed to dismantle many of the formerly intractable barriers to pedestrian and bicycle projects. Things like lack of money, lack of precedents, lack of what we call battle-tested safety standards. So the big challenge, the big question, I guess, is how to advance such projects through an inclusive process, creating structures and facilities that work, and ensuring costs and benefits are equitably distributed in timelines that actually get infrastructure in the ground now when we need it. This, to me, is the big overarching research question that we need to be tackling. And it takes us back to my argument that we really need a whole new approach to mobility planning based on this question, based on the lessons we take away right now, and in the next few years about how the pandemic affected how we live, work, travel, and participate in our cities. And this is how I think we get there. By expanding what we know through rigorous practice-linked research that recognizes the forces driving cities' mobility responses to the pandemic, explores differences in the response speed and scale of cities' actions and local response timelines, digs deep into the role of planning and public engagement in motivating and shaping cities' responses, and interrogates the processes behind the responses, and then evaluates impacts broadly through seeking out information from a really wide range of voices. There's a ton of research ahead of us to figure this out, and it's more important than ever because the way we've traditionally accommodated walking and biking, it's unsustainable and it's unjust. From a planning standpoint, I think we've got three separate questions we need to address and push in order to ensure we don't revert to business as usual and instead build new, better practices for planning for active mobility and better use of public street space. First question, do we need a crisis to prompt practice changes? Cities were able to act quickly in response to changing mobility demands because the pandemic was obviously a more powerful impetus for change than our ongoing slow burn crises like climate change, road safety, mobility justice. In the future, can we just make these changes without a sudden crisis? Second, cities have demonstrated a strong appetite for new mobility approaches. Cities' newfound tolerance for experimentation, willingness to use temporary materials, and enactment of emergency regulations help dismantle traditional barriers to pedestrian and bicycle projects. Will those barriers return after the pandemic subsides? And finally, our normal processes for involving the public in planning were sidelined in many instances during the pandemic. This crisis planning approach received strong backlash in some cities, but other cities were able to move past it and develop in situ engagement and adaptation strategies. Will this learn by doing approach become the norm for transportation projects, particularly for pedestrian and bicycle projects? Will other new methods of engagement emerge? And how will those new methods change the practice of mobility planning?